Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Juliet Hooker. Juliet is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science. She's a political theorist specializing in racial justice, Black political thought, Latin American political thought, democratic theory, and contemporary political theory. She also has written on racism and Afro descent, indigenous politics in Latin America. Before coming to Brown, she was a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss, Theorizing Race in America, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, Race and Politics of Solidarity, and the author of Black Indigenous Resistance in the Americas, From Multiculturalism to Racist Backlash. Professor Hooker served as co-chair of American Political Science Association's Presidential Task Force on Racial and Social Justice, Social Class Inequalities in America, and the Associate Director of Teresa Lonzo Long Institute of Latin American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. She has received full fellowships and awards from the National Endowment of Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard, and the Advanced Research Collaboration of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We welcome Juliet to the show. Well, so good to have Dr. Hooker on the show today. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So I'd love to ask my guests a question, kind of warm us up a little bit, get a chance to know you. What's the best piece of advice you ever received?
So this is work-related advice, but when I was writing my dissertation, one of my committee members told me, don't chase after the topic that everybody is writing about or that seems to be in vogue. The thing that's going to allow you to finish a project is if you write about something that you really care about. And I think that has stood me well in terms of, working on things that I feel really strongly about.
We must have had the same people in our committee that got that same advice. And I'm almost done, so it has helped.
Yes, it was good advice.
It was, because it's been a long 3-year process. If you don't like what you're writing about, you will quit. I'm always curious about people in your life who have served to be an inspiration to you. You want to give those people kind of a chance to give them a shout out and thank you for being so influential in your upbringing and your development?
Absolutely. So I think, my family has been an enormous inspiration as well as support. In particular, I think my parents, gave me an example of public service and of really finding ways in their community to try to help people and to, contribute to the community, make it a better place. And, it was an example of how you could be in community and that the kind of work that requires, it doesn't have to be something grand. It's just sort of caring about people around you.
I love that. I read your bio. It's a very impressive bio. And I'm kind of curious. You want to kind of walk us through your journey. And I'm also curious to, as you go through that journey, tell us about lessons you learned along the way.
Sure. So I grew up on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and which is a historically Black and Indigenous space that where people really, Black people in particular, have been treated as kind of second class citizens in the rest of the country historically. And so that was the background. And of course, when I came to the US, it was at the end of the 1980s when the Civil War was happening in Nicaragua. And I think when I came here to the US, one of the first things that I encountered was people saying, you're here and you're taking, positions from Americans, that kind of anti-immigrant feeling that a lot of people had. And so that was something that I felt like I had to come to terms with and figure out, how to deal with. And I think as I continued my career, I went on to get a university degree and a PhD, and my first job was actually teaching for many years at the University of Texas at Austin. So, being, I think, at a large public university was really, I think, a really good place to start my career because I really like that public service mission that public universities have to educate the citizens of the state, even though, of course, it's like subject to all of the ways in which, legislatures often try to interfere with what universities do. So there was a lot of tensions around that. But I think the mission of saying, you're here to educate the citizens of the state was, I think, really inspiring.
That's great.
To me.
I'm curious, since you mentioned a PhD, what was your PhD's focus? I'm just always curious what you were writing on and doing your research on.
Yeah, so my PhD was looking at the way in which theories of multicultural citizenship, right? The idea that you have diverse societies and that the state has to make decisions that have an impact on how people can see themselves reflected. So, right, there's an official language. And if you have people speaking multiple languages and your language isn't the official language, that has an impact on you. And so it was trying to think about those kinds of debates and policies. And, a lot of the research that hadn't been done up to that point had focused on cases in Europe, in Canada, in the United States. And so I was looking at the ways in which people were thinking about and trying to implement those policies in Latin America, which hadn't really been discussed as much up to that point.
Interesting. So I always love to ask this question too. What was your biggest surprise in your research that you weren't expecting?
That is a really good question. I think early on in my research, I think the thing that was surprising and for me was when I was looking at what was happening in Latin America, I was realizing that even though they had both been historically discriminated against, that Indigenous people actually kind of fit the model of the group that was more able to receive rights from the state than Afro-descendants in Latin America, because Black people just weren't recognized as a distinct cultural group in the region. And so they just didn't fit people's ideas of the kind of group that should receive recognition from the state. And so that was one of the things that I ended up writing a lot about early on in my career.
Interesting. That is surprising.
Yeah.
So let's dive into your book. I'm curious to find out why you wrote the book, Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss.
Yeah, so I actually started writing the book in 2016, and it was in response really to watching the uprising in Ferguson and seeing how, those protests were met with such a militarized and really violent response. And then at the same time, there were a lot of people who were criticizing the protesters, right, for not protesting in the right way, And so it made me think about the grief and anger that people were feeling and the kind of limited ability that they had to express that in that moment. And so I started thinking about the question of, what do Black people do with their grief, right? How do they use it or try to, make sense of it, particularly politically in politics? And then, of course, as 2016 wore on, there was the presidential election, and then the Trump campaign, and the sort of rhetoric, anti-immigrant, kind of misogynist, rhetoric that was coming from them. And then I started to think about how white grievance, this sense of resentment that was really animating that campaign, was happening at the same time as Black people were literally out there protesting in the streets because they were being killed. And so it seemed to me that these were two ways in which people were mobilizing around loss, some real, some perceived, and that we needed to be able to think about them simultaneously. And so that's how the book came about.
As you talk about, my Bible study came out because of the same Ferguson experience. I actually served as a pastor in that neighboring community, so I kind of knew the Ferguson community. I was surprised at the outside influences that came into Ferguson and shaped some of the narrative that was going on there. And it was kind of interesting to kind of see that. And I wrote a Bible study to kind of help the church deal with same thing you're talking about, deal with how do we talk about race in a Christian context that's going to be beneficial for both sides. So I tried to act as a kind of a cultural translator to translate what Blacks were saying and what whites were saying and try to say, here's what you're misunderstanding in the conversation. I'm curious, in your work, how do you deal with the fact that the Black grief is based on trauma? And you're right, there's no real avenue for that trauma and that grief to be expressed. When it is expressed, oftentimes it's met with resistance because nobody wants to feel the weight of the past issues. And so it's like, I don't want to deal with that. It's like when someone has a loved one die and they're grieving and like, yeah, I don't want to hear that. It makes me feel sad. So let's move on to something else. Right. So you're causing trauma to the other person who doesn't want to hear it either. So how does your book kind of deal with that tension? Could you kind of brought up, how do you deal with that tension in our country?
Yeah. So, what I do in the book is really try to show that there's been, at the same time that I think that is very much a reaction that people are like, we don't want to deal. On the other hand, I think the pattern has been that there's been a reliance on Black people becoming these kind of heroic activists to make racial progress after they've suffered enormous losses, and that this is how social change happens in this country, right? So you have, Mamie Till Mobley, who has the open casket funeral for her son, Emmett, and this is really an important event that galvanizes the civil rights movement. And, you have the movement for Black lives, all of these other examples where people become activists after they've suffered these enormous losses. And we call them, right, warriors or social justice warriors, and that, I think that, that often obscures that people are grieving, right? That yes, it's heroic that they're doing this kind of activism, but they're still grieving, and we're not giving them space to grieve, because you have to grieve in these really acceptable ways so you don't make other people uncomfortable, right?
Right.
And so part of the argument is to say that we need to find other ways to think about how racial change can happen that doesn't depend on people doing this kind of activism and having to, to really do this work in a way that can limit their ability to, express their full humanity. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting to think about is, the ways in which things like, a global pandemic and, or something like that might actually force people to think about the fact that you can't escape loss, grief, right? Those are human experiences that we all have.
So now that you've kind of opened that door of acceptable ways to grieve, but also acceptable ways to create change, what suggestions, because I mean, we're still struggling with that. How do we all want to see something different. I mean, I served in some very, very downtrodden and poor communities. I served in Detroit, Michigan area. I served in inner city St. Louis, in the Chicago area. And there were people there who were hurting and no one listened. And as I describe it, no one listened until something was on fire. And you're right. We don't want to wait till things get on fire for you to listen. But how do you help people in those situations who are dealing with poor education, with high crime, with lack of opportunity in employment? How do we begin to change the culture so that we begin to make systemic changes to their circumstances so they can actually live the American dream?
So, I mean, that of course is a huge question. I think that, we're all trying to think about. One thing that I would say is I think we need to move as the country as a whole beyond this kind of zero-sum mentality that I think people often have, where it's if you're doing something to pay attention to the needs of one group, that is somehow taking away from others, right? So it's this idea, that you see when people respond to things like Black Lives Matter by saying, oh, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter. This isn't the claim that other lives don't matter. It's saying, let's look at this particular problem, right? And so I think this kind of zero-sum mentality, this idea that if we pay attention to people who are suffering, that we're somehow taking something away from other people, really makes it difficult to focus on the fact that there are all kinds of people who need us to show care and concern and to try to alleviate the problems, that they're suffering in this country.
So you're not gonna give me a magic bullet to solve everything then?
Sorry, out of magic bullets today.
I do wonder why we can't have the conversations. That you're right. I think we really can't achieve anything if we can't have the open, honest conversation that there are people that are hurting. And us not realizing that they're hurting people doesn't do the situation or us as a nation justice. So you wrote the book with what hope in mind? What was your goal?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
And now a word from one of our sponsors, For Freedom Mobile. If you're using AT&T, Verizon, or T-Mobile, then you're being tracked. Mobile providers collect your location, communications, internet activity, even your financial transaction. They sell that data to anyone willing to pay for it and provide it to the government without a warrant. Switch to For Freedom Mobile, and you won't ever have to worry about Big Tech or Big Brother tracking you through your mobile phone again. For Freedom Mobile provides secure, unlimited talk, text, and high-speed data for just $29.99 a month, and it includes free internet roaming in over 200 countries. Sign up for the service by visiting forfreedommobile.com and using the promo code BRIDGEBUILDERS to get your first month for only $9.99. See forfreedommobile.com for details, just like the number 4, freedommobile.com.
So I think my overall goal was that it would help clarify some of the things that we were all seeing and experiencing, but that we, sometimes we see things and we notice this pattern, right? But we don't have a language sometimes to describe it or to explain it. And so one hope was that it would help people make sense of the things that they were already experiencing and reinforce that, this pattern that you think you're seeing is happening. And the other goal was really to try to honor the activists who I think often we say that we honor them, but we also expect these kinds of heroic actions without thinking about the impact on them. So it was really about saying, how do we honor the extraordinary activism of people while also thinking about what else can we do rather than simply relying on their labor. I think about when, we have elections and we all know all of the barriers that are in place for people of color to exercise their right to vote. And you'll see these news stories every election, right? Some 80-year-old Black person who stood in line for hours trying to vote. And yes, that's heroic. And these people displayed enormous kind of, civic, commitment. But actually, that's a sign that something is wrong with our democracy if people have to do that. Like, that's a sign of a problem. So I think we often, in these moments, we say, oh, look at what this person did, rather than saying the fact that they had to do that is a call to all of us to try to fix that issue.
In the book, I read part of your book, and I was very impressed by how you tried to explain things. So are you trying to get us having a common language? Is your hope from your book as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be helpful, I think, if we could see, for example, that people are mobilizing around loss. And that doesn't mean that we have to say that those losses are equivalent or they're the same, right? But that there is, for example, for people who are animated by white grievance, that there is this perception of loss. And I talk about, how the losses that people are reacting to in those cases are often anticipatory losses, right? There are these things that haven't happened, but people have this kind of, this fear and panic about these, for example, potential demographic change, or what is it going to mean if you have more immigrants, or whatever the thing is that is driving them. And so part of it is hoping that by naming, right, what's happening and talking about it, that we'll be able to identify the patterns and to think about, for example, how, I'm obviously not the only person to make this argument, but that every time that there's been some movement for social change in this country, there's been resistance and backlash, and that has historically been the pattern.
So you talk about political loss. Define that for us, because I know we have in our own mind when we hear that what we think of, but how do you define political loss in your book?
This is a really good question, right? So, of course, we've all experienced loss, right? Loss is a universal human experience, right? We've all lost promotion, or we've, lost a loved one, or preferred candidate, or sports team didn't win, right? But those aren't necessarily political losses. What I call political losses are losses that are, for example, the result of state action or inaction. So, for example, there is, a fire in a building and a lot of people are hurt, and that could have been prevented if there had been, the right regulations in place, right? So that's a way in which you have a failure of the state, and that leads to a loss. So that's a political loss. Or if you think about, the ways in which, state governments were involved in maintaining segregation, for example, in the South, right? That's a political loss. But there are other losses that also become political because they are things that we're all affected by and involved in having to change. So, for example, if you think about the 9/11, right? Everybody understands that as a political loss because it was an attack by foreign actors. But if you think about the Me Too movement, before people mobilize and women mobilize around sexual harassment, sexual violence, a lot of people saw that as an individual problem that individual women were experiencing, as opposed to this larger problem that is political because it is happening in workplaces, it is happening, in all of these spheres, and it affects the ability of people to have equal dignity in this society.
I get it. One other term you have in your book we should probably cover is, how do you define white grievance?
Yeah, so I talk about white grievance as, so white grievance refers to the way in which people are mobilizing in response to a perception of loss, right? So that's why I talk about anticipatory loss, right? That there is a sense that whites as a group are being displaced from their dominant position in US politics, right? Their position as a dominant group socially, economically, politically, and that this is illegitimate, right? Because historically they have been the dominant group. So, you see this, being mobilized. And for example, when people argue that, as they did after the 2020 election, for example, that some of the results were, weren't valid, and they focus often on large urban cities, right, where you had a lot of minority populations and a lot of urban voters, because they didn't see them as, quote unquote, real Americans, as Sarah Palin used to say. And so their votes shouldn't count as much, right? They shouldn't get to decide. So I see white grievance as a way in which you have a segment of white citizens in this country who are mobilizing in response to what they see as the displacement of their group from this dominant position in U.S. politics, and really trying to reassert their dominance.
So, to play devil's advocate,
Mm-hmm.
there may be some anticipatory part to that as well, but in some cases, some actions have resulted in losses. So how I guess as we move forward as a people, we have to kind of understand that loss is loss, whether it's real or perceived, and it still has the same social emotional impact on you, even physiological impact. If you feel a sense of loss, real or imagined, the internal part of you still feels that. So how do we as a nation move forward when they're both sides of the spectrum are feeling some sense of loss? How do we come together as a nation and say, I acknowledge that you may feel this way or you may experience this, and I acknowledge that you're experiencing that. How can we work together so that in the end we both move forward?
So one of the things that that I'm particularly interested in the book is thinking about democracy, right? And thinking about how we can live together in equality. And part of the way that I think you can distinguish between losses that we need to pay attention to and those that we don't is to say, for example, are you pointing to something that is, a legitimate loss or something that isn't, right? So if you're mourning the loss of unearned, right, advantages that were the result of, the histories of white supremacy in this country, like, yes, that's a loss, but that's not necessarily a loss that you can expect the people who suffered as a result of, of those systems to mourn with you, right? So I think that part of what I'm saying is that I think by recognizing that just because the loss isn't real, that doesn't mean, or just because it might be the loss of something that shouldn't have been, something that people had access to in the first place, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be experienced as a loss. But that doesn't mean that the answer is to then say we need to think of these things as equivalent, right? Or requiring the same response. I mean, part of what I do argue in the book is that, white grievance as it's manifesting itself is this form of resentment that's leading people to say, if democracy leads to outcomes that I don't agree with, then I'm willing to dispense with democracy. And I think that, from the point of view of, a democratic theorist, which is one of the things that I am, that's a problem, right? And that part of what we need to remember is that, yes, democracy is about winning, but it's also about losing, right? If somebody, that it's also about accepting that sometimes you are going to lose.
So I get that. And it's interesting. But that also goes on both sides of the argument. We're all of us are going to lose at some point. We're never going to always get our political wishes. But in that loss, we still have to figure out as Americans how we, accept the fact that we didn't get our way in this particular decision. We still have to honor the decision that happened. So how do we continue to go, I would have voted differently, and I did vote differently. I didn't get the outcome I wanted, but we're still one nation. How do we live together? As I get the sense we're losing a sense of harmony. I mean, we never had a total harmony. Of course, this is near utopia, but we're becoming so divided that I'm not sure either side wants to accept any results that aren't the ones that are favorable. That's where I see that we're going. That's dangerous as a nation.
So, I mean, I think, often I think I have a little bit of a different perspective on this, in the sense that, often people will say that the problem that we're having right now is polarization, right? So they'll say people are so polarized, they're so, wedded to their particular perspectives that they can't come to any kind of agreement. And I think that when we talk about, whether we're more divided or, than we were in the past, like, one thing to remember is that the issue isn't so much whether we're divided. I mean, we can be, and often people point to the 1950s, right, as a time when there was more, cooperation in Congress, where you had more bipartisanship. But that was because there was agreement to preserve segregation, right, among other things. So that wasn't in that there may have been harmony, but it wasn't, harmony that was accompanied by justice, by equality, by any of those things. So I think that when we think about this question of, division, polarization, I think we need to remember that there can be less division, but it can mean that we're agreeing to outcomes that are really unequal and unjust. And so that the question is, how do we get, to a more just and equal society? And I think, one of the, the history of things like, you think about the civil rights movement, right? People at the time said, that they were divisive, that they were, causing these confrontations. People were very critical at the time. So I think when you have these moments where people are really trying to reassess, right, the conditions they're living in, it's often contentious, right? It's not harmonious because you have disagreements.
I guess when I think of working together, I'm not necessarily thinking of harmony as much as I'm thinking of the ability for both sides to say, let's bring our best self to the table and let's work out some agreement that benefits both sides. Because I think each side of our political aisle has some positives and some negatives. But when they work together to solve things and they're open to that, I spent a time last summer doing something on policy, and it was one of those classes where oh, good Lord, policy. But I realized that we don't do policy sometimes from the perspective of how do we make sure that both sides give up something for a good policy. Both sides have to lose something. But they come together to agree that this is for the greater good. And I don't see as much of that. That's what I'm thinking about. How do we come together and find out what's for the greater good and not so much not so divisive, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I think one, a good example of this is that often I think people, use these kind of cultural issues to obscure the fact that people could all benefit from certain kinds of policies, right? So when you think about the ways in which, right, in certain states, they've rejected things like Medicare expansion, which would help so many people who don't have access to health care. And often the ways in which these, this is done is to say, well, if we do this, this is like a giveaway to these people that we don't want to give things to or who are already taking too much, right? And so I think part of it is being able to see how do we get away from the sense that our politics or policy preferences should be dominated by trying to get things from my group and deny other groups, the things that they want, and instead say, what are the ways in which we can make, come together around policies that benefit everyone and that can actually, improve people's lives in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, that I agree with. I'm curious, as you get feedback on your book, what are you hearing in terms of feedback? How is your book being received?
So, it's been really great. It's been received really positively. I wasn't sure how it would be received. And it's been really, I've had a lot of really good conversations. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting to me is that, the argument, for example, that people mobilize around loss and that this is something that leads people to act politically in this way is that people kind of intuitively grasp that and really kind of get that concept. And so that has been really, really great.
Good. So I love to ask this question. What are you most excited about in this season of your life?
So I think one of the things that we all came out of the pandemic realizing is the importance of connection, right? Of being able to spend time with each other and to cultivate relationships, friends, family. So for me, that's one of the things that I'm really really excited to find time to do and to make that time a priority is to say, how can I be in community with people in really meaningful ways?
So is there another book on horizon you're working on now that you've finished this one? I know you started in 2016. So if you started in 2016, was there a 2018 book you were also starting?
So there might be a book. I'm not sure if it's going to be a book yet, but I am thinking about, there was this work that I was doing when I was working on this book on thinking about monuments and the work that they do and how we should respond to them. So I'm doing some research and writing on those questions right now.
That's great. As you think about the impact you're making with race, and you have a long history of being an advocate for social justice, racial justice, what do you want your legacy to be?
This is a tough question. I think, I hope that my work will continue to be relevant, years down the line. I hope people will read it and continue to refer to it. But I think the most concrete thing that I want my legacy to be is training my students, right? Is being able to teach and to help people come to realize that, their opinions matter and that they have something to say that that is important for other people to hear. That's something that I think is really important to me about the work that I do.
So here's your chance to give your students kind of a mini graduation message. What message of hope do you want to give to your students who are about to enter the world?
So I think what I would say is that they inspire me. I think when I look at young people today, I was talking to a colleague who said, when she started teaching, a lot of people were talking about how young people were so apathetic and they weren't involved. And I think when you look, at so many movements today, you see so many young people who are, even if you disagree with what their positions are or their activism, that they're so involved and they care so much and they have so much of a sense of, that it's important to to really stand by their principles and be consistent with them. And I think that's really inspiring.
That's great. So where can people find your book and connect with you on social media?
So you can find the book. It's on Amazon and it's on the Princeton University Press website as well. And there is audio and digital versions, so you can read or listen or on your preferred platform. And I'm on formerly Twitter, so you can find me there as well.
Do you read the book yourself? Are you the voice of the book?
No, there was a professional reader who did the audio.
Okay. I always think sometimes I heard an author who did his own reading. So
I was happy that there was someone else doing it. I hate the sound of my voice, so
join the club. Anything I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
So I think this was great. I think if anything, I think what I would say is, that one of the things that I really, and, I think is really important in the book is really paying attention to the stories of people who are ordinary people who end up living these extraordinary lives and whom we can learn so much from. So one of my favorite chapters in the book, In Black Grief, White Grievance, is this chapter that looks at the life and activism of Harriet Jacobs, who was enslaved and frees herself through this incredible story and writes a slave narrative. And then Ida B. Wells, the great journalist and anti-lynching crusader. So so part of it is hoping that people will pick up the book and be inspired to learn more about, previous generations of activists as well as the ones that they're more familiar with.
Well, thank you so much for taking time for my audience and sharing with us what you're working on and your hopes and dreams to help us create a better world.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at @bkeithhaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin or on his website at alightbreaksthrough.org. Thanks again and tune in next time.
Do you know that most entrepreneurs hit a revenue ceiling and have no idea why? They're working harder, spending more money, running more ads, but revenue stays flat. My friend Dr. Noah St. John calls this the invisible break. He's giving our listeners a free revenue ceiling audit to help you see what's really holding you back. You'll get a free 30-day membership to NoahBot, giving you access to Dr. Noah's 30 years of experience to help you reach your next level. But hurry, because there's only 50 available this month. So if you're tired of being stuck at the same revenue level and want to finally break through, get your free revenue ceiling audit at drnoahvault.com in the affiliate link that'll be listed in the show notes.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at @bkeithhaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin. Thanks again and tune in next time.